Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Dana. This is my cohort, Sasha. We're moderating the panel. We are joined here today by an esteemed group of filmmakers whose work is playing here at True False this year. Tinatin Gurchiani, the director of The Machine Which Makes Everything Disappear. Maxim Pozdorovkin, one of the co-directors of Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer. Askold Kurov, one of the directors of Winter Go Away. And Madeline Sackler, the director of Secret Screening Red, whose name shall go unspoken, but whose film screened last night. So before we start talking, we have a reel with clips from each of the films. So let's get that started, and we'll talk afterwards.
Это Столешников переулок, старейшее место Москвы. Здесь была проведена одна из первых акций Pussy Riot. Вот здесь салон красоты, они входили даже в салон красоты, выступали на сцене. Как бы эстетика группы Pussy Riot – это появляться в каких-то местах и шокировать публику. В этом есть определенный политический и общественный месседж. Бросается камень в пруд, ну это прямо как хайку японская. От камня расходятся круги. И какой-то из этих кругов на воде становится цунами, а какой ведь это ж неизвестно.
Вы на точке? Передавай всем привет! Все, мы начинаем работу, прием. Блять, парус. Ёбаный же ты парус. Россия без Путина.
Раз, два, три!
Путин, уходи!
ყველაფრით დაღლილი ვარ.
რატომ არავინ მკითხა? მინდოდა თუ არა საერთოდ ამ ჭაობში, რომელსაც ცხოვრება ქვია, ჩაფლული იყავი.
ცოლი მინდა რა.
შენ მინახარ?
გადაღება მინდა.
რა, კინოში?
ხო.
ვისი როლი გინდა რომ ითამაშო?
რის და თავარი როლი.
Great. Well, the first question I'd like to ask is, the immediate thing that comes to mind watching all of this stuff is how has the proliferation of digital filmmaking technology and media changed the role of artists and responsibilities and role of artists and filmmakers in these societies in confronting political repression. And perhaps Maxim, we can start with you.
I mean, I think that's the global phenomena of the sort of new participatory citizen journalism has had a great effect in terms of making the political protests much more visible. And I think that you see that in sort of the Arab Spring and all these other revolutionary movements. And I think that at least, I think in the Russian and Belarusian cases, that I think that several of the films here touch upon, it's also allowed for these new artists that use media to essentially give them visibility, but also give them a voice. And I think it's influenced a lot of the way that artists and political artists function in these societies more than anything like that. So I think that has been, so there's both kind of a visibility of a protest movement and an alternative sort of information sphere, as well as kind of a new path for artistic developments and new paths for political art.
Great. Madeline, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so for us it was hugely advantageous because we were able to work with a lot of filmmakers underground in Belarus, and so because the file sizes are smaller and everything is digital now, they could actually be filming, hundreds of hours of content pretty subversively and then smuggling it out of the country just on hard drives and shipping it to us. So every 2 or 3 months or so, we would be getting these sort of like treasure troves of hard drives with all of this amazing content from on the ground in a country where otherwise it would be extremely difficult to be filming at all.
Right. Askold, perhaps you can add to this?
I will speak in Russian.
And I'll translate.
Нет, конечно, во-первых, то, что сам размер камеры, он достаточно компактный и позволяет быть очень мобильным, перемещаться быстро и, самое главное, очень близко подходить к герою.
I mean, first, the size of the cameras and the small, compact sizes has been incredibly important for allowing people to just get close to the action and to the character.
И у нас, например, для фильма, нас снимало 10 режиссеров, и в итоге у нас было около 1000 часов материала. Это как бы другая, обратная сторона вот этих возможностей.
And in our case, we had about 10 directors filming, and altogether we've amassed about 1,000 hours of footage, which is also sort of
Это всего лишь 2 месяца для того,
just
чтобы...
2 months to edit it.
Thank you. Tinatin, anything else?
I can agree with everything what they told about, but for me personally, I never worked like this because I'm director first of all, and I work with straight concepts, and I never take 100 of hours of material. I know what I have to get and how I get it in short time, but it's other concept, I think. But in other cases, like when you are filming revolution and all this stuff, it's different, and it's great opportunity.
I was also wondering if you guys could go one by one and tell us, have these films been seen in their country of origin? And if so, what was the reaction to them? These and several of these governments, exert a lot of control over how they're portrayed internationally, and it would be useful to understand, what, if any, has been the sort of contact with representatives and what the nature of their reactions were. Maybe we can start with you, Madeline.
Well, I'm an easy one because the answer is no. So we just screened the film last night for the first time anywhere. But I think, we're...
Would you say it's inconceivable that the film will be screened in
Yeah,
Belarus?
we're highly cognizant that there's absolutely no way this film will be screened publicly in Belarus, so we're starting to work on ways to distribute it underground and digitally there. So there's a pretty pretty dense network of underground journalists and artists and activists that we feel like is a great opportunity to just give the film away. So we'll be doing that there and hopefully in other repressive regimes around the world.
Let me ask you another question. What, if any, what impact will the film being shown at film festivals internationally, if at all, have on the subjects?
Should I answer that?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, it makes a huge difference. So, you know, these festivals kind of are a launching pad, really, for films like this that are very difficult to get seen really anywhere. I mean, and so I think, you know, what a lot of us are doing is thinking very deeply about, you know, what are the points of leverage for the films? How can we use them for change? And we start thinking about that, you know, from the festival stage on. So these types of conversations are really helpful, and I think we're all, you know, always really open to what people are responding to and how we can kind of tailor the life of the film to where it can be most useful.
Thanks. In Askold, has the film been seen in Russia? Will it screen in Moscow?
Да, ну фестиваль был показан только на фильм был показан только на фестивалях и в каких-то небольших аудиториях, в клубах, и в прошлом году по кабельному каналу 24 Док.
So far it's been shown at festivals as well as at cineclub showings, and last year it was shown on a cable channel, sort of a documentary-specific cable channel.
Конечно, он никогда не будет показан по центральным каналам или на больших площадках, потому что для этого нужно иметь специальное удостоверение, специальное разрешение от Министерства культуры.
He said it won't be shown on sort of large federal channels because for that you would need permission from the Ministry of Culture.
In what, if any, has been the reaction of the Kremlin?
Власти никак не реагируют. Единственная реакция была в Тюмени, когда губернатор запретил показ.
There hasn't been that much official reaction from the government, but the only exception being a screening in Tyumen where the governor had forbidden it being shown.
Я не думаю, что этот фильм для них представляет какую-то опасность, потому что они имеют позицию игнорировать любую информацию. Например, на парламентских выборах были многочисленные нарушения, которые были сняты на видео и выложены в YouTube.
But in actuality, Askold doesn't think that it's much of a threat to the government because, for example, there was massive election fraud in during the parliamentary elections, and it was well documented on video and YouTube, and it didn't really seem to make much of a difference since a lot of information flow is so controlled.
И председатель избирательной комиссии сказал, что это все подделка, это было снято на конспиративных квартирах на американские деньги.
And the response has always been that these were staged recreations of election filmed at apartments and funded by the U.S. State Department.
I say that with a straight face. So, Maxim, in your case, from what I can gather, the Putin administration is aware of the existence of Pussy Riot. Are you having any interaction with people in the administration or government, or what have you heard, and will the film be seen?
I think the film will be seen probably, and we're talking about doing a screening in May. Hasn't been. I mean, I think in Russia, with Pussy Riot specifically, because it's such a big story, and it plays out like a soap opera in a lot of in Russia. So I think that it will be seen. I wanted to add one point to Madeline's, is I think that one of the, and this maybe goes back to the new media question, is that in a lot of these places that don't have distribution networks in place for art house or oppositional type cinema, people tend to be very savvy with things like BitTorrent technology and all these other things. So there is distribution of that. And I saw your film on BitTorrent. So
that's the new Samizdat.
Yeah, that is the new Samizdat.
And maybe just for the benefit of the audience, you could talk a little bit more specifically about the current situation with the members of Pussy Riot and where things stand with their legal proceedings, just because I think it's something people are very curious about.
Well, Masha and Nadia are still in jail in 2 separate colonies. They have about a little bit over a year left in their sentence. it's somewhat doubtful. They have several appeals pending, but it's somewhat doubtful whether they'll be eligible for early release because of various kinds of violations that they were charged with. Actually, just the other day, I think Nadia was punished for something for walking without supervision in the camp, and that would prevent her from getting early release. But yes, so technically they would be released March 3rd of next year.
And what, if any, political impact do you anticipate the film would or might have on that situation? Is it likely that, you know, that the increased visibility and awareness that either the film creates would exert pressure on the regime to?
I mean, the only conceivable way I could see is by virtue of having it more visible. I think that the only context would be with the Sochi Olympics coming up, and there would be international pressure in connection to that. So, I mean, in terms of the film, I think it would continue already kind of the mass attention that the case had attracted. So I think only in this way that if it continues to be this case that refuses to go away to the annoyance of the government, which was actually the case from the beginning. I think that had the government known that it would grow into this big thing, they probably wouldn't have pursued it at the outset, or they wouldn't have decided to.
Right.
Or they would have abandoned the case earlier.
And Tinatin, what about you? Has the film been seen in Tbilisi, or tell us a little bit about the history?
Our film is quite new. We finished end of October, but we had really very big festival run already. We have invitations from all important festivals all around the world, and I think people like it because of universal issues. They are not why they are interested in this small country. It is not premier, I think, but they learn also a lot about Georgia. But I'm always try to accent that it is not objective film about Georgia. It's very subjective. I did it as an author. About feelings I had about young people in Georgia, and it was also screened 2 times at this Tbilisi Film Festival. It won a prize as the best Georgian film too, and so I had, and now we start theatrical release from April. It's first time that documentary goes in cinemas in Georgia. But we also start in US and Europe with this film. It's successful. But I think my impression was that for people, it's a little bit painful in a way. For me, it's not pessimistic or depressing film. It's the opposite of it, but in a different way. But for people, because I try to give voice, young people in Georgia, they feel like kind of tiredness because we have so permanent challenges with different governments and wars and discussions without ending, and they have very difficult starting position. In this time, I shot this film last 2011, and afterwards changed this government in Georgia. But I think these issues, these problems for young people, they stayed, and it's much also in this situation, and it's painful for Georgians to see it.
I wanted to actually ask a little bit more about that. Like the situation certainly in Belarus and Russia is distinct from that in Georgia, and that the Georgian government is not nearly as repressive with respect to media and how it's portrayed. Yes. Certainly by comparison with Russia and Belarus. But what kind of barriers did you encounter with people on an individual level, that they were reluctant to talk about certain things, or I mean, how was the sort of internal censorship that people sort of shape?
In Georgia, we don't have stable situation. Everything is like all 6 months or one year is possible. Next revolution, next government comes, and they bring also new courses, new politics in a way, not for abroad but for inside. They now this new government started to this old government as criminals and to put them in jails and all this stuff. It's also very tiring because they did also a lot. It was not the best government for us, but it is not really good analysis of situation, and young people cannot identify what we are now, where we are now, and how we can start. But it's not really big repressions like Russia or Belarus. We have also free media in a way. We have, of course, we have different channels. They are for government and against government, but you can choose.
Mm-hmm. I think in all of these films you see the impact and consequence of these political activities on the lives of your subjects. And one thing I was curious about was what that impact really. What is the impact of making the film on these people's lives? And was there ever a point in the process of making the film where any of you were sort of forced to question if it was worth it to continue, or if the sort of real life consequences at stake were in some ways, jeopardizing the lives of people who you were documenting?
So, I mean, for me, I don't think that we were putting them in danger. Whether or not we were questioning if we should keep making the film is another thing. I think everyone making these films at some point questions whether they're crazy or not. But I think in a way, actually, hopefully the film will be protecting the people in it. We talked about this a little bit last night, but in a way, I think journalists are really the biggest advocates for people going through these situations. And so often they'll find that if they get arrested and then there's a piece that's published internationally, they'll be released more quickly. So hopefully it'll be the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
Ну, в нашем случае не было такого момента, когда мы думали, продолжать снимать или нет. И вообще во время съемок такого страха не испытывали.
In our case, there wasn't really a question of whether to continue or not, and we didn't really have much fear while filming.
Больше всего мы боялись уже после того, как у нас был на руках весь материал. Это около вот те самые 1000 часов.
Mostly it was once we had the 1,000 hours already on our hands.
Потому что мы боялись, что он может заинтересовать какие-то спецслужбы.
We were concerned that it might be of interest to various special service agencies and extremism agencies.
Were any of the filmmakers who participated detained at any point in the process?
Во время съемок нет никого.
No, not during the film.
И в первую очередь, конечно, из-за того, что вот был этот материал, снятый в храме Христа Спасителя с акции «Пусть Riot», потому что в тот момент как раз продолжалось следствие.
Yeah, and particularly the material that was filmed inside the Christ the Savior Cathedral of the Pussy Riot action, because that was just as the investigation of that case was unfolding, and so they were gathering material.
Поэтому нам приходилось, во-первых, думать, какую часть этого материала можно вставлять в фильм и как его вставлять, чтобы не навредить и девушкам из Pussy Riot, и тем, кто снимал.
And so we had to think about which parts we could use so as not to potentially harm either the Pussy Riot members or the people filming there. Right. Because technically, like, you weren't allowed to film in the cathedral.
Да, потому что тогда шли разговоры о том, чтобы судить не только участниц Pussy Riot, но и тех, кто снимал эту акцию.
Yeah, because at first there was talk of trying to prosecute not just the Pussy Riot members, but also the people that kind of came in, and the journalists that came in and snuck in and filmed the action. And I mean, I guess I could piggyback on that answer. And I think it is also kind of an important difference between something like the Belarusian case and the Russian case, whereas I think in Belarus there is actually much more straight up repression of journalists and of governments. I think in Russia the situation is slightly different, whereas for the most part there's tons of liberal newspapers and liberal cable channels and Echo Moskva and all these other things where you could openly speak and say as much negative things about Putin as you want. I think that the government approach is mostly through, it's almost like a carpet bombing approach in the sense that by controlling certain federal channels, you guarantee yourself enough of an electorate. And in a way, some people make the same point about Fox News and how that works in terms of just galvanizing and kind of controlling a conservative mindset. And I think in Russia, it's much more that, whereas a lot of the deaths that have come to journalists have been more specific to various investigations and the specific things like that.
Yeah, I want to actually just pick up on that a little bit. Is it your sense that there is a coherent strategy on the part of Putin or the Kremlin in general to deal with opposition activity or opposition journalists, or that in fact it's much more sort of ad hoc, specific agencies responding to specific threats in an uncoordinated way? Because I think sometimes there's a tendency to believe that because Putin is a strongman, that he's actually controlling everything that's going on in a more strategic way than I think is actually the case. What's your sense of that?
My sense is that that side of it is grossly overstated in terms of how orchestrated it is. I think that it's a lot of organs doing what they believe that they're supposed to and kind of having orders from up top. But I don't think that that's that it's as coordinated. Вопрос был, думаешь ли ты, что как бы иногда говорят, что это как бы все махинации Путина, которые организованы только Путиным, или это просто какие-то конкретные органы, которые так реагируют, и просто репрессии в самой системе, как бы.
Ну, я не знаю, как устроена система, честно говоря.
I'm not sure how the system actually works in the structure of it.
And Maxim, perhaps you could sort of walk us through the genesis of the project, how this all sort of came to pass after the Pussy Riot action in the cathedral, leading to the trial itself and the process of culling through all of this material and trying to, bring that story to life.
Well, we started filming shortly after the arrest. I mean, I had known about them, and I was in Moscow around the time after their arrest, actually working on a different film. And my collaborator Mike and I, we started filming, and initially the film was much more, because we didn't know what would happen at the trial and whether the trial would be filmed, let alone what happened. Originally, I suppose the film was much more about the contextual situation around Russia and around the trial, with a lot more participation from the lawyers and other kind of fellow activists. And I suppose the film changed a little bit when we got this sort of treasure trove of trial footage. That the trial happened to be filmed and filmed extremely well, and also there was just sort of verite material even from the trial of the girls interacting amongst themselves. So at that point, I suppose the film changed and became much more, they came out as the stronger characters and ultimately pushed a lot of the other material out of the way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, another thing that sort of wonder about is what is your objective as filmmakers? What are you trying to achieve? Do you see these films as vehicles for political change? And in some sense, I guess in the case of the film about Belarus, it won't be seen in its country of origin, but in almost all of these cases, there's, I guess, a question of whether or not you're, preaching to the choir in some sense, and whether or not, it reflects the views of, mainstream society. From what I understand, Pussy Riot is actually quite unpopular in most of Russia, and I was just curious if any of you have a perspective on that you'd like to share.
Tina, how do you, maybe you started.
I thought it's about Pussy Riot.
No, it's a general question.
You can start.
Нет, у нас не было таких задач больших, у нас не было иллюзий, что фильм может как-то повлиять реально на ситуацию в стране или даже на мировоззрение людей.
We didn't have any illusions that the film could actually really influence what's happening in the country or even the world view of the general population.
Наша основная задача как документалистов была зафиксировать те события, которые уникальные события и уникальное время, которое в то время было в России.
Yeah, for us it was mostly to document this unique historical moment in Russia at that time, and that was basically the main goal.
Если это как-то поможет изменить ситуацию, мы будем счастливы.
If it actually does something and helps transform a situation, we'd be very happy about it.
И у нас достаточно специфический фильм, у нас нет закадровых комментариев, например. Да? Мы просто показываем то, что видели сами.
And our film is somewhat specific and somewhat unique in that there's no voiceover, there's no narration. It's just basically.
Это очень отличается от телевизионного жанра.
And that's very different from a TV genre.
И мы часто встречали претензию в России на показах, когда зрители говорят, ну, вот что же вы показываете, не объясняете, что такое, что хорошо, а что плохо. Как же мы поймем, вот, что вот это хорошо, а это плохо?
And well, audience response in Russia has been interesting because a lot of times people took issue with the fact that we didn't explain what's good, what's bad, rather than that they just showed it.
На что мы отвечаем, что вы свободны сами сделать выводы.
And we would always say that you're free to make up your own mind and your own conclusion. I mean, I'll say that for us in terms of Pussy Riot, I guess it's a film that sort of straddles both, I mean, hopefully it's seen in Russia as well as in the West. And for me, I felt like that there was this myopia with regards to what they did and who they were, both in Russia and in the U.S. and in the West, whereas in the West it was represented very much as a sort of human rights martyrdom, story of martyrdom, where these sort of poor innocent people are punished unjustly. And in Russia they're presented much more as sort of just vulgar hooligans, anti-religious hatred. And the truth is way more interesting, and it's a much richer story about really the limits of acceptable free speech and the rise of religious fundamentalism and how you square all these things. And so I guess for me, the goal was always how to tell the story and tease out that greater complexity in the story, because it's just a better story than what's been told.
Right. What was your objective in making the film, and do you think that you've achieved it?
I think I wanted to give voice young people they did not have, because nobody asks them how they feel like, and I think I achieved this goal, and it's very controversial. People started to discuss about it, all these intellectuals, and because also a big resonance of this film everywhere, and it's also a picture, it's opposite picture of Georgia, because we try to sell Georgia as a very sunny and modern country with new buildings, and this is also true. There was built a lot, and we have also a lot of freedom, but I think it can be better in Georgia, and these people have also right to exist, and they need also voice. And I did, and I think it's no danger for them to be part of this film, because it's more human. I have more human stories, and they never speak about political stuff. But I can remember, as I made a similar film, it was short film in Iran, many people had to left their jobs and country. It was a big scandal in their life. It was a big challenge. And it was also without politics, this film. I think if you have dictatorship in country, everything is political, everything what happens. I asked people in Iran only to speak about happiness and all this stuff, but it was after screening, it was half-hour silence. I could I never experienced this before. It was such a heavy mood in this room, because it was, for them, was very, very intense, sad and tragical to this short film. And in Georgia, maybe it could be the same when people start to cry about it, but it is not a danger for them. It's more emotional.
Thank you. Yes. Madeline, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the what you set out to accomplish, and if you feel that you've done that, and what impact you think the film will have on the life of the free theater and politics and art in Belarus.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I met the subjects of the film, which are the Free Theater of Belarus. I think I'm allowed to say that, not get thrown off the panel. And really, so I didn't know that this was happening, to be honest. I didn't realize that the situation was so bad in Belarus, and I saw what I thought was just an interesting opportunity as a filmmaker to try to combine different types of art, so trying to bring together theater along with film and in different sort of types of combinations to create sort of a sense of heightened reality to hopefully sort of turn the lens on a country that I think is very underreported on in this country. So hopefully we achieved that, but time will tell.
Do these regimes, I mean, they're obviously all different, care about how they're perceived internationally? Do they monitor this? Does the impact of this film, of any of these films internationally figure into their thinking? Is it something that they, follow, or are they completely oblivious and disinterested?
I got support from both government because my project won for funding, for state funding, and it was also signed for freedom, because they could not guess what I will do this film. And new government helped us to go to Sundance with money. I think it was not sunny picture of Georgia, but both of governments helped us to make this film.
I think that that the Russian government and the Putin government is definitely, he himself is kind of incredibly obsessed with his own PR and his own public image, and I think he's become more obsessed over the years. And I think that they do care in a certain way. I think that a lot of the rich sort of Russian elite and government, they do want to be seen as part of this kind of European bourgeois elite. And stories like this and a lot of the kind of the human rights violations and all those things that come out, I think throw a cog in that wheel a little bit. So I think there is this sort of irritation, and you see this, I think recently Angela Merkel was confronted Putin about Pussy Riot, and he gets very, can I say bitchy about it, and so it is definitely an irritant, and a lot of these stories do kind of undermine this international picture that governments try to present.
Я не знаю, волнует ли их собственный имидж. У меня такое ощущение, что они все время делают вид, что они не в курсе, что происходит, и пытаются игнорировать. Это такая вот снобистская позиция. И единственный способ, который быть услышанным, нашли вот Pussy Riot. Да? Они нашли эту точку в России, где можно сказать что-то и быть услышанным, но это очень опасно.
Yeah, Askold said that for the most part, he's not sure whether the government really cares that much about kind of what's said about them, and the pretense they tend to present themselves as being oblivious to all these things and a lot of the kind of the human rights and oppositional tendencies, and the only exception being Pussy Riot, who found this sort of combination and managed to be heard throughout, even if throughout Russia, and kind of discussed, etc.
Это вот точка, где можно общаться с Богом и с Путиным.
Yeah, it's that perfect location where you can speak both to God and Putin at the same time.
just maybe one final question before we open up to the floor for Q&A. It sounds in a certain respect like the governments, particularly in Belarus and Russia, actually don't care that much, right? I mean, about the actual making of the film, because they understand that it'll be shown abroad, to, as Dana said, largely preaching to the choir. So the film festivals in the West are audiences that are inclined to, support the idea that there should be more free speech, these regimes are fundamentally oppressive, and so on. But there's a disconnect between that audience and the audience. I mean, as Madeline in your film and Askold in your film, one of the things that comes through is that actually a large number of people in these societies actually support the current regime, right? Whether because they're scared of instability or because they remember greater instability in the past. How do you unite those two things? How do you bring the message that appeals to a Western audience and to some westernized elites in these countries and tie that up with the broader majority of kind of the silent majorities in these countries? Or is that even possible?
Go ahead.
Я думаю, что они этого не боятся только потому, что главный способ управления вот тем самым населением, которое поддерживает, это федеральные каналы. А аудитория наших фильмов, она никогда не сравнится с аудиторией федеральных каналов. Вот и все.
Yeah, Askold said that mostly I think that they can afford not to care because the audience for these types of films can't compare to the audience that the federal channels and the state channels receive. And I'll just add something to it, that I've always, that television in Russia is pretty much free. It's practically бесплатно. And I often wondered that if people had to pay for how much like people pay for cable here, how that would change the political situation.
Yeah, let me add to that. I mean, as information gets harder to control, is greater transparency inevitable? Everyone has cameras, everything is being documented. Where are things headed? Do you guys, any of you, see trends that you think are useful to consider in the context of this debate?
I think you cannot. I tried to go to jails for my film, but it was not possible. I think its control is not really visible. I think for inside, for all of these countries, they have control on these main channels. In Georgia, for example, Rustavi too, who has this channel, he will win elections. It's clear. And all these smaller channels on all these newspapers, they are not important. They don't have influence on society. And also, I think these kind of films they need for abroad as a sign that it's freedom, a kind of medial freedom. So they can do what they want, but they know these films cannot influence these countries from inside.
I mean, Madeline, in your film, you see these sort of spasms of free expression that are then immediately stifled very quickly. How do you sort of do? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I was actually going to say I think it's not true that in Belarus they don't care. There are very, very few filmmakers there. There was one main documentarian whose legs were broken and his house was broken into. So we were very, very careful. We only worked with cinematographers that had accreditation, so that if they were stopped on the street, they would, hopefully they would be safe. And we only had a couple of people on the streets during the very violent protests who were filming anyway for news, so they were capturing, for us, just greater content that they would have been doing anyway. So I don't know, I think it's a little bit different maybe, than in Russia. And so for me, that makes me sort of hopeful, because I think if we are able to distribute the film there, I think it provides sort of a new access point for people and hopefully starts to create sort of more of a network, and more people maybe can start distributing content like that. I mean, we don't think that we'll be felling the dictator with the film, but I do think that it makes a difference for people to see footage like this.
I think your question touches upon something very interesting, and I think it's almost, the question will be extremely important in like 15, 20 years as there is a generational shift and there's a new generation that gets access to information through these other more disparate, more dissipated channels. as opposed to, whereas the control of whereas the federal kind of state channels lose some of their influence. And I think that's going to be the interesting question, because I think so many of these governments are old-fashioned in the way that they tend to focus on just the mass media, which is basically the main television channels. And how I think that will actually be probably the single most important thing in the transition.
But you were pointing to something important too, I think, which is that, I mean, unfortunately in Belarus, like the opposition movement is very like centered in the cities, and outside of the city there isn't access to these sort of trickles of free media that are starting to appear. And the government is very good at tackling those trickles. So, you know, they'll arrest people who are running the online newspapers and the filmmakers, like I mentioned, and so they don't kind of get out of Minsk. And so that makes it very, very difficult for there to be larger swells of change. And I think, you know, I saw a lot of parallels between our two films. And I think it's just like, it's sad to watch, because there are these sort of swells of freedom and expression, but like when people are getting arrested right after that, I mean, it's just human nature for fatigue to set in, and how long can you sort of go on? So, I mean, I hope that these films sort of help, you know, re-inspire people to demand, you know, what they deserve, because they're very brave for doing that.
Я думаю, что они прекрасно понимают, что они не в состоянии контролировать информацию вообще, пока есть интернет, пока есть социальные сети и другие каналы, но они могут контролировать только большинство населения.
So I think they're well aware that they can't control the information flow, because as long as there's internet and social networking and all these things. But so that's why they put the stake on the general population, the majority.
Да, и они имеют технологии для того, чтобы нейтрализовать любую информацию. Например, вот было 2 фильма, рассказывающие об оппозиции, о митингах протеста. Там была такая концентрация лжи и рассказ о том, что люди выходят против Путина на американские деньги, там, за какие-то еще, что все они шпионы и так далее. И они где-то снимали, как какие-то актеры получают деньги за эти митинги. Вот это вот их способы, их методы.
And the main means has been to really do a lot on sort of federal TV channels to discredit the opposition. And so there's these 2 famous primetime shows, Momentov, and that really aim to discredit the protest movement and to essentially recreate certain things and argue that it was all funded by the State Department and that was all these things. So there's a lot of media that plays on the xenophobia that exists sort of in the general population.
What is strongmen? There's so many strongmen who have a history of being cinephiles. What's the connection between those 2 things? You always hear that many of these sort of strongmen or authoritarian leaders have deeply cinematic, you know, imaginations, both in terms of how they construct narratives about their regimes and present themselves, but also you hear that there's a deep connection to movies, that they're watching movies constantly. In fact, almost every major political leader, you get the sense that they watch a lot of movies. What's the connection between these things? That's something that's always fascinated me.
It's always like, because Lenin, it's funny, Lenin was not a cinephile. Lenin did not watch hardly any movies. He didn't really like them. I mean, he talked about cinema a little bit. Stalin watched absolutely everything. And Stalin gave very strange notes to people as well for the movies. I don't know I don't think Putin watches that many. He doesn't seem like a cinephile. But Stalin would give, the most famous example is when Eisenstein and Cherkasov would, they were called to Stalin, and Stalin, he had some notes on Ivan the Terrible. The first one was that Ivan's beard was like a centimeter too long, and then the second one was that when Ivan kisses his wife, it goes on for 2.5 seconds longer than it should. And I know these other things, but then there's, of course, Kim Jong-il is a big fan of.
Lukashenko, big film buff?
I don't know. Do you know?
I have the faintest idea.
No idea.
But Putin likes to make his own films of himself doing things, carrying on in the Siberian wilderness and so on. I mean, it's I mean, the Kremlin press office is very, has a very elaborate conception of this image that they like to present of Putin.
There was also a romantic comedy about him called A Kiss Not for the Press. That played in big theaters.
Но Путин считает сам себя очень креативным. Он в одном из интервью признался, что он сам придумывает вот эти вот акции, полет со стерхами или доставание этих древнегреческих амфор со дна моря.
Well, Putin sort of sees himself as very creative, and in one interview he admitted that that a lot of the kind of public relations things, whether it's like flying with the cranes or pulling out these ancient vases from the bottom of a lake, that he came up with ideas himself for staging these.
Let's see if any of you have questions that you'd like to ask. Anyone? Wow. Stunned silence.
Everything is clear.
I'm sorry, just wait a moment. They're bringing a microphone over to you.
I just came from the screening of the Winter Go-Away, but I couldn't stay for the Q&A. Just occurred to me, after having amassed all that collective footages you have among the 10 of you, were you at some point concerned about security or, protecting those wells?
Да, единственное, чего мы боялись за все время работы над фильмом, это за материал. Поскольку работа велась круглосуточно в течение 2 месяцев, нам приходилось отсматривать этот материал, и мы сидели на секретной квартире, никому не говорили адрес, у нас были специальные обозначения для того, чтобы говорить, где мы находимся. Вот за материал мы очень боялись.
Yeah, that was the main concern, was the material, and they were editing in sort of a secret location that they didn't tell anyone where the apartment was, and they just for 2 months straight they would watch material and select it.
Но все обошлось.
But it turned out fine.
Anyone else? Maybe you guys could just tell us.
I'm wondering about like the basic concept of internet access in the different countries you filmed in. The basic concept of like internet access for the public. I know when I was in Russia, I had to like register with my passport to even get like a USB to connect to the internet, and I wonder like in America it's so taken for granted that like you can just go to any cafe and log in to Wi-Fi.
Really, you had to register for the internet?
Yeah.
That's strange. Yeah.
I mean, you could go to like the internet cafes and stuff like that. But for internet access, I think it's fine. I wonder how much do people fear that they're being tracked on a daily basis?
In Belarus, they definitely are. So they manipulate the internet in lots of ways. So like on the night of the election, they actually shut down all of the cell phones and access to the internet for that night. So nobody could tweet or Facebook or email or even call each other. And then they definitely are tracking emails, and they're pretty sure that they're monitoring Skype as well, although there hasn't been proof. There's a rumor going around, I don't actually know if this is true, but that Lukashenko was trying to work out how to buy the Chinese firewall. So I don't know, we'll see what that means, but.
I mean, my impression has been, and this is actually from doing, filming another film that's kind of has a lot of secret military stuff in Russia that probably should be monitored. That the services, like the intelligence services, tend to be kind of behind the times, and they still operate in a world that's sort of 15 or 20 years behind. So my impression is that they're not as media savvy as they should. As they should be. And I think that even like the spy scandal in New York, when if you actually look at what those people were doing, they were, getting paid, and I imagine well for basically publicly available information that anyone could have. So I think that internet access and internet piracy and the use of internet is very rampant, and Russians tend to be very good at using it for various ends.
Я не знаю насчет интернета, ну, известно, что часто могут взламывать и почтовые ящики, и Facebook, да, ну, определенных людей, за которыми они следят. Но телефоны точно прослушиваются, и многие герои, которых мы снимали, мы знали совершенно точно, что их телефоны прослушиваются, а значит, наши тоже, потому что мы им звонили часто.
He says, I'm not sure about the internet, but we know that many of the characters who we filmed had their phones tapped, and so we assumed ours were tapped as well as a result, and that then it's not unheard of that people's, I guess, email or Facebook accounts were hacked into.
How does that paranoia manifest itself? Do you find yourself, you know, thinking about this while you're doing your work? I would have to imagine that you know is a strain, and does it ever impact the way you choose to approach something?
You know, for me, I have a very curious sort of is that at a certain point I realized, and this was actually in the U.S., that my phone was probably being tapped or should have been, and it made me incredibly open. Like I would just talk about everything possible on the phone, just so that there's absolutely no sense that you're hiding anything. So that's how. I'm sure it's different.
У нас было, да, было что-то похоже на паранойю, когда мы монтировали фильм. Но я уже говорил, что мы по телефону не называли никогда точных адресов и имен. Вот. И
yeah, there's some paranoia when we were editing the film, and like I said before, when over the telephone we wouldn't discuss any addresses or names where we were editing.
И в этой квартире, на которой мы монтировали, у нас были везде развешаны какие-то куски картона, бумага, где были написаны там герои, какие-то события. И у нас был один наш режиссер, не буду его называть по имени, он очень боялся вот слова Pussy Riot. Он когда видел, он везде всегда зачеркивал, рвал и прятал куда-нибудь.
And he said in this apartment we would have these cardboard sheets with the names of characters and the names of all these people written out, and one of the directors of the film was particularly paranoid about the name Pussy Riot, so whenever Pussy Riot appeared, he would rip it up and cross it out and hide it.
Any other questions out there? Anything else you're curious about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing is, you know, to what extent, I mean, you said, you know, the Russian security services are very much behind the times in controlling the internet. That's certainly true by comparison with the Chinese, who were on that right from the start. To what extent is the government itself using new media to discredit people, right? I mean, there was this whole flurry of incidents where journalists were being caught in sort of honey trap, you know, videotape things, and they would circulate those on the internet. I mean, to what extent is there kind of a war between artists using new media and the government sort of wading into this as well?
One thing I noticed while filming Pussy Riot was that a lot of the protests, the cops and the riot squad would have their own cameraman. And so a lot of times there would be, like I remember one night there was a little mini protest outside the jail where the girls were being held. And there was like, it was Kate's 30th birthday, and there was fireworks set off. But the police had their own cameraman that was filming the protesters. So in a way, it's this trying to always create a media counterweight of evidence for what was filmed, I think, on other sort of cameras.
They do that here too, though.
Mm-hmm.
You see police at rallies filming people.
Right, yeah.
I mean, not though.
Oh yeah, with Occupy they did that a ton, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Мне кажется, что достаточно бездарно пока используется. Я часто на каких-то форумах есть так называемые тролли, которые специально сидят и постят какие-нибудь провокационные комментарии в адрес там, лидеров оппозиции или каких-то участников.
He thinks that for the most part it's also sort of inadequate and kind of sloppy the way it's done, and he says that on certain forums there's these people called trolls who are clearly sort of official people sent to infiltrate and try to provoke and spread negative information, negative rumors about various opposition leaders, etc., then to try to slander and discredit them.
Любопытный случай был во время съемок. на митинг в поддержку Путина со всей России привозили людей, потому что добровольно никто не хотел идти на этот митинг.
And one of my curious is that for one of the pro-Putin rallies, there all these people bust in from all over Russia to attend. And so,
Нет, или кто-то за деньги. Вот,
and they were supposedly paid as well.
С Урала шел целый поезд рабочих, которых везли на этот митинг. Это было очень интересно, потому что они всю дорогу готовились, рисовали плакаты, проходили какое-то занятие по политинформации.
Как советское время. And there was one train from the Ural Mountains that had kind of a train load full of workers that were there, and on the train they were drawing and making posters and having kind of political information classes held for them.
И мы очень хотели снимать этих рабочих в процессе подготовки, но нас не пустили, потому что в каждом вагоне было по 2 представителя секретных служб, которые охраняли этих рабочих от внешнего мира.
And we really wanted to film on this train, but we weren't allowed to because every single train car had two FSB agents who were kind of protecting and shielding off these train cars of workers from the media.
Очень странно.
I mean,
is
there a question?
Can I say something?
Oh, of course,
I
please.
think in this fight, best strategy for governments is to hire famous filmmakers or famous journalists, especially in US, also from Georgia. And both governments could get them to make like a propaganda. Unfortunately, the journalists do it for money, I think.
Right. I mean,
your countries.
Gerard Depardieu now wants to make a film about how Chechnya is great. I mean, that's, you know.
Yes, I heard also about Kusturica that he was hired for, but he did not done at the end this film about war between Georgia and Russia, and also famous musicians. And they have power, I think, artists, and they are used for it.
I mean, what is the self-image of these governments? How do they see themselves, when their security apparatus is mobilized to violently suppress, dissent? How do they reconcile that, in ways that sort of suggest that there's a legitimacy problem, but clearly they view it totally differently? I mean, maybe you have a perspective on it as well, Sasha, but I'm just curious about how, when they see these representations of themselves in the media, how they view it.
Yeah, just while it's, I mean, I would say I think one thing that's important is that, the government's main audience in a lot of these countries, again, is not us here, right? It's this kind of larger silent majority. I mean, if you look at Russia, like there's sort of the middle class elite in Moscow is very opposed to Putin, but you still have this broader mass of sort of more conservative, paternalistic, state-dependent Russians who still support the system, either because they look back to the past and they think things are better now than they were, which is a justified view, or because they look ahead and they say, changing things now, it's not worth risking instability or chaos or well-being. And so the government is able to twist this kind of message of nationalism and conservatism. It's part of the reason why the Russian government went after Pussy Riot so fanatically, was because they knew, as you mentioned earlier, that most of the Russian population supported that action. And if you look at polling, most Russians think that Pussy Riot should have been punished more severely, not less severely. Mm-hmm. So their focus is more on this kind of conservative, sort of broader mass of not unlike in the U.S. I mean, it's not, so that's how I just think about that in a certain way. But I don't know, Maxim or Askold.
Мне кажется, что Путин и вообще правительство находится в некоторой такой эйфории, опьянении, потому что из-за безнаказанности они понимают, что они могут делать все, что угодно, и ничего, и это будет безнаказанно, все это стерпится. Вот все законы, вот этот процесс над Pussy Riot совершенно абсурдный, да, и вот все последующие законы о митингах, об иностранных агентах, о пропаганде гомосексуализма, о усыновлении русских детей американцами, Там столько абсурда, но возмущается меньшинство, а большинство думают так, придерживаются той точки зрения, которую им значит, в готовом виде дают через федеральные средства массовой информации.
He says that I think that the government is in a state of sort of drunken euphoria where they feel like they can really get away with anything because there is this sort of mass support. So things such as like the absurd Pussy Riot trial, the legislation against banning adoptions for U.S. the adoption of Russian children by U.S. There's a lot of laws about against the promotion of homosexuality, all these things. So I think that, yeah, that there's kind of a small opposition leftist minority that is against that, and then, you know, the wide mass tends to be either okay with it, and they're obviously swayed by federal channels as well. I mean, I'll add to that I guess, for me, I always feel that actually a lot of the repressive tendencies aren't actually necessary for, at least in Russia, for the government to do. I think that they would be perfectly fine if they didn't do it, but I think that it's because of where the people in the government come from, and that they do come from sort of an older, more Soviet background where there was kind of harsher punishment for hooliganism, and there's just a way of treating dissent that was very different in those times, that they're almost on autopilot to a certain extent in reacting to these things. And I think that they would probably be, I don't think that they would lose power as a result if they did not kind of stifle the opposition.
There's a question over here, I think.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you, while you were making your movies, if you felt any pressure or any danger, if you felt that maybe the government was aware and was doing, I mean, if you had any troubles while making your movies just because it's in Soviet Union and you might, I mean, there might be some dangers that is not in the Western countries.
I never had.
Madeline?
Yeah,
dive in?
Okay. No, I mean, so we didn't. I mean, aside from there was some violence at one of the protests that we were filming at, and the cameraman got sort of hit by a secret policeman, and but he ended up not getting arrested and wasn't badly injured. So we didn't have anything too bad.
Yeah.
There's kind of tricks, you know, like you obviously are trying to avoid situations like that, so you're doing whatever you can to make sure that doesn't happen. So I don't think it's an accident. Like, we could have been putting ourselves in compromising situations, and you know, it's not worth it to do that. I don't think.
Во время съемок мы не чувствовали, потому что, ну, есть такой своеобразный эффект камеры, когда для тебя все происходящее находится вот в мониторе видоискателя, ты как бы защищен этим пространством. Поэтому самого чувства такого страха нет. Хотя действительно опасные ситуации были, когда и подавляли эти митинги, там были, конечно, эти дубинки полицейские, все, но из наших никто не пострадал.
Yeah, he says that of course there were that we didn't really feel that much, and part of that has to do with what Askold calls the camera effect, where you're almost you almost have this telescoped vision into the LCD screen, and you feel kind of protected by it, even incorrectly so. But even though that, of course, there were incidents where when certain kinds of rallies were put down, et cetera, where objectively speaking they were somewhat dangerous.
Только один раз пострадала у нас режиссер Мадина Мустафина, но не на акциях протеста, а на избирательном участке за то, что она снимала не то, что нужно. Председатель этой избирательной комиссии сломала ей микрофон и чуть не разбила камеру.
The only incident is that one of our directors, it wasn't during a protest, it was during an election where an election monitor thought that she was filming something that she wasn't supposed to, so he broke her microphone and almost broke her camera as well. And then I get this question a lot in the Q&As, and I wish I had a better story, but actually in our case, if anything, the kind of official Russian government has been very cooperative in that a lot of our film uses this trial footage that was filmed by I mean, it's a private, but it's a private state news agency, sort of like Reuters, RIA Novosti, and we were able to, it was actually they were very cooperative and they were great to work with, and they gave us incredible footage, so.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for coming, thank our panelists, and if you have other questions, you can speak with them afterwards.